Hello, and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzy Ostwald. Jerusalem, one of the holiest sites in all the world. The three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all consider Jerusalem to be a revered and sacred place. And we find there the Garden of Gethsemane. Gethsemane means olive trees, and there are several ancient and newer olive trees still in the garden. My guest today, Wendy Babcox, has captured haunting images of the olive trees of Gethsemane in her art project, Every Olive Tree in the Garden of Gethsemane. Welcome, Wendy. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here and talk to you today about it.
Yeah, before we start, I just wanted to say that I've been to the Turchin Center to view your exhibit twice now,
Okay.
and it is a stunning exhibit. And the images are haunting. It's the word that keeps coming to my mind. So I'm really looking forward to talking to you about your project.
Thank you.
Why don't you start by just telling us about your work, the type of art you produce, and maybe what led you to the Garden of Gethsemane to work on this project.
Okay. So I have a background in photography. That's my sort of roots in terms of my education. But my art practice is wide-ranging, very wide-ranging. And I would say a through line through all my projects there's often a lens-based component to it, but probably one of the most significant components is that I often work with other women. And so that's how I ended up visiting the Garden of Gethsemane in the first place. I was part of a women's collective called 6+, and we curated an exhibition with 6 US-based artists and 8 Palestinian women artists. And so we went to the West Bank, to Bethlehem, in fact, and worked with young women in the Dahisha refugee camp there, doing a storytelling project. And I've made, I think, 5 visits now.
Wow.
It's such a compelling experience to be there that I find myself returning. And I had the first time that I came upon the garden on a trip to Jerusalem one day, it just made a profound impact. And so I think as an outsider to that area, it felt as if it was hard to make my own work in Israel or in Palestine, but there was something about the garden that seemed like a sort of safe zone to explore a photography project.
Well, that's interesting. Of course, the garden is a pilgrimage site for religious people, and they will often describe a sense of peace when they're in the garden. And you said that the first time you visited, it had a profound impact. Can you describe a little more of what you felt when you visited the garden for the first time?
Yeah, we sort of came upon it. We just stumbled across the garden. I think in our minds, sometimes the Holy Land is this big expanse. It's far away from us, so we don't really understand, in fact, how close everything is to all those religious sites that we really read about, how close they are to one another. And so we had gone for a walk down the Mount of Olives and just ended up at the Garden of Gethsemane, walked in, and the trees are undeniably beautiful. And you immediately associate them with what you know, which is, as you mentioned, that it's the place where we're told that Christ prayed the night before he was arrested by the Romans. And so there's this line in history from, me stumbling into the garden and the story that I know. But then just the sort of material experience of the trees is so profound because they're undeniably old. And when you stand in the gardens, there are guides there that will suggest that the trees are 2,000 years old. In fact, I think the oldest one has been carbon dated to about 1090 or somewhere in that region. And so, so they're all, but that's 1,000 years.
That's
you know, it's like 1,000 years.
Right.
And so there's something about that just feels profound, where, and it makes human existence seem quite small.
So you've talked about, we have an image here that I'm assuming this is one of the older trees in the garden.
Yeah, it's the only one that looks quite like this. And there are parts of the tree that grow up and then parts die off, and sometimes. So, and this one I loved. You can sort of see in the bottom there's a little watering can and some
Right.
tools
Yeah.
right there. So they just have this kind of presence about them.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me, and this is a good image to talk about this, is this is a still photograph, but you've captured movement within the still photograph. And you get this sense of movement, and as you said, you get this sense of a history, because obviously it's an ancient tree. And we know this one dates to the time of the Crusades, and who knows if there's some sort of genealogy that would stretch back even further. But you talk about the sense of history between these ancient trees, and then maybe we can get a photograph of the younger sapling. Which,
Yeah.
So maybe you can talk a little bit more about that. But it sounds like there's the younger sapling to contrast to the 1,000-year-old tree.
Yeah. So I think equally impressive to me, when you're standing in front of this very gnarled trunk of the tree, and the knowledge that it's lived 1,000 years. And there are buildings and, there's architecture in the city of Jerusalem that is very old. But there is nothing that had led a living, continuous existence.
Right.
Something that's alive.
Yes.
And so that feels very poignant. And then for me, the younger trees, and in many cases they've been planted by popes, for instance. The younger trees, to me, are this kind of full of latent possibility, hopefully.
Right.
Into the future. So I like to think of this tree at the beginning of its 1,000 years.
Ah, that's interesting. Yeah, so you talk about things that religious studies folk talk about all the time, the sense of time,
Yeah.
and a sense of sacred time, really.
Yeah.
A sense of sacred place in the garden itself. But you also implied that there's something about, this is a great tree to look at here, that your eye as an artist saw something here that maybe others don't. I mean, there's something artistic about the composition that I think it would take an artist to immediately recognize.
Well, I think it's for me, the art in the work is not so much the composition, but a combination of things. It's having something that I want to unpack through the work, for instance. So, and that is this sort of, on many levels, this issue of time. But it's also this relationship of time and sacred place to, a kind of conflicted site. So the city of Jerusalem is a very conflicted space. It's a very small space, as you say, that houses, the three major Abrahamic religions, and they literally exist shoulder to shoulder. You can, throw a rock from one part, from one quarter of the city to the next, and so there is this sense of conflict, and or there exists this conflict in that place, and we know from watching news reports that things like placing the embassy for the United States into the city of Jerusalem is a very loaded action. So I think so my work is not overtly engaging with that, but I guess on a very implicit level, I think about the trees as witnesses, as witnesses to the passage of time, to ritual, to faith, but also to conflict, and that's kind of important to my thinking, I guess. And so I think for the trees to really become these individual beings and sort of embodied in some way, I had to sort of separate them from the background. And the garden, the trees are in very close proximity to one another, so I had to sort of edit out the background. And that was a process that took me about 2 years.
That's amazing. Yeah, I was reading a little bit about your technique. So this is a particular type of photography, photo etching, and maybe you could speak to that a little bit, because I think it's important how you produce the images, but also the stroke of genius of editing out the background, which blows my mind. When you look at the leaves, and I'm thinking about what you must have had to do, but it does bring the tree out into stark relief and lets it speak for itself.
Yeah. So there's no genius. It's just discipline. It's just or just stubborn, commitment to an idea that you realize halfway through was maybe a little too challenging or something. But I did want them to stand alone, and there is no magic Photoshop button that you can use to kind of decide which tree belongs to which tree. So it was just a sort of very long, methodical, but also I would say kind of meditative process of editing, trying to figure out which branch belongs to which tree and which leaves belong to which branch.
That took an incredible amount of discipline and perseverance, much like the trees. The gnarled trunks, I think, to me, when you speak about the trees witnessing conflict, I mean, symbolically, that's kind of what I see when I look at these gnarled, weathered, ancient trunks. But the olive tree, too, is often considered a symbol of peace and hope. So you've got these kind of dual symbols here going on.
Absolutely.
With these trees.
Yeah, I mean, just like, the sort of conflicted nature of a city that's, trying to be shared amongst different faiths. The project has these sort of many facets, I think. And the young tree, I think, is in many ways speaking to that, right? Like speaking to the promise and the future and the potential, the latent, experience of what is to come. And so, and I think probably important to mention too, this process that we used, which I printed with my husband, who's an expert in this process. It's called photogravure, which is, as you said, it's an etched process. So it's a copper plate, and you expose the image onto a gelatin, and then etch the plate. And so you're literally creating a physical space for the ink to sit. And so it's a very physical presence of ink on the paper, ultimately. And so those marks, that kind of experience of texture, hopefully follows all the way through.
It gives it a three-dimensional effect, kind of. It's really a kind of remarkable production here, and I'm glad to hear you describe it, just so we know you're not out there with your phone snapping quick photographs, right?
Far from it, yeah.
So the garden itself has been a pilgrimage site for centuries, and I've never been there, but I would imagine that it would be a kind of meditative space that has a deep impact on pilgrims who visit it. So this morning I walked back to the museum again, and I was alone. It was early. And I kind of felt a little bit of that, right? I mean, it was quiet, it was meditative. So I'm just wondering, do any of the visitors to your exhibit ever express that actually going to the exhibit is a type of pilgrimage
Oh gosh.
or an impactful moment as they stand there looking at these trees?
Oh, I wouldn't even presume to think that they would have such a profound experience. But I mean, I hope that the project is meaningful. It took up such a big chunk of my life, and I feel so committed to it that. And honestly, in the Turchin Center, they have done a wonderful job of showing the work, and we arranged the images in clusters to sort of replicate how the trees are grouped together in the garden, because they're sort of in little quadrants, and so that's why they're not sort of all in a row. But they've also lit it so artfully so that there's a sort of lovely spotlight that hits the image, and then it dissolves off. And so I feel like you can have these kind of intimate moments with the trees and sort of forget everything else. So they've done a really wonderful job.
It's almost a halo effect,
Yeah.
the way they have the lighting there.
Yeah, they've done a really fabulous
So
job.
can you talk a little bit about sacred space or place? I know that's something we talk about as religious studies scholars, but it seems like in art, you're reproducing a place, and you're communicating a sense of place. Is that something you think about consciously? Is that something you thought about in this project? I mean, I guess obviously removing the background was part of that process, but what were your thought processes along those lines?
Well, I think whenever I'm making this work, when I was making this work, I was very cognizant of the fact that not many people get to visit the garden. It's not that easy to travel these days at all, but it's not easy to travel to that city, and it feels very far away. And yet, in our consciousness, or if we've read anything about the life of Jesus, we feel a connection to it. So, and I guess that very first profound experience in the garden really left an impression on me. I read a lot of writing by someone called Lucy Lepard when I was a student, and she talks a lot about the sort of power of place. And so, and after all, I was sort of drawn back there over and over again.
Right.
And so, for so many reasons, I feel like it's there's a particular connection to that place, whether it's through faith, or whether it's through history, or any kind of connection. So it's always very foremost in my mind is sort of conveying, I guess, the power of the place.
Right, and power is a good word. I think when I hear people talk about sense of place, particularly pilgrimage sites, this sense of power or something special, in energy perhaps, and you mentioned it, this thing that keeps drawing you back to that place.
Yeah. And honestly, in Bethlehem too, to visit the Church of the Nativity, I'm not a deeply religious person, but you can also, I feel like I can also really appreciate and celebrate the fact that this place holds so much power that it draws us to it. And so that's another space that's very powerful.
Well, I think you've done something brilliant with this. In my mind, you have the place, which in and of itself is special and sacred and has this kind of sense of power. But trees Malone also, in the history of religions, have the sense of sacredness. I think partly because of their ability to live for so long and they get large. And but I was thinking as I was looking at this exhibit about the tree of life symbolism that is so ubiquitous in religions, and the tree kind of symbolizes this bridge between heaven and earth with,
Right.
with the roots and the branches. Did any of that, I mean, I guess I'm asking, is there something about the trees separate from the garden that captured your imagination and drew you
Oh,
in?
absolutely. I'm pretty I'm pretty fascinated with a lot of the research that is sort of coming to the forefront right now about trees as a sort of, I don't want to say sentient beings, but that that trees are far more complex than we give them credit for. That they are altruistic in some circumstances, that they share resources, and that in fact they even different types of trees are interconnected in ways that we had never imagined. And so I like to think of the ways in which all trees, not just these trees, but the sort of power of trees. There's a great book about trees called The Secret Life of Trees, I think it's called. But it talks about just the complexity that we haven't really credited them with. And so, yeah, that's very much a part of the project.
Yeah, and in many ancient traditions, trees are sacred in and
Yeah.
of themselves. You know, we go to California and we look at the redwoods and we hike and we're amongst the trees. So I think you're right, and I think that's what I got about this exhibit was the Garden of Gethsemane. Yes, it's a sacred place, but
Yeah.
the way you have highlighted and focused on the trees themselves give them the ability to speak a whole different kind of sacred language.
That's lovely. It's a lovely way of thinking about it. Someone today told me that they're like portraits.
They are, yes, they
Yeah.
are. And I found myself, particularly with the old gnarled trees, I would sit there for a long time trying to pick out images in the trunk, you know, and see if there were any kind of hidden meanings there. But yeah, they do speak to you, and I think it's again, you know, testimony to the technique you've used here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think there's when I was in graduate school, I read a book by Roland Barthes, and he talks a lot about how you know about the sort of indexical properties of an image, of a photograph, and to me, in lots of ways, they are not just a witness but a record, and I kind of believe that the trunks are written with the history.
Yeah, yeah. So brings me to another kind of interesting topic for a religious studies scholar, I think, this kind of relationship between image and spirituality, or between art and religion. Obviously, icons are an important part of many religious traditions.
Yeah.
Religious art becomes objects of devotion in and of themselves. Did you think about that as you were working on this project, that you know this place that you're recording, as you said, through your art, might function in many people's lives as a kind of icon itself, or as a kind of entrance into spirituality? Is there?
My project?
Well, I think I think your project, yes, absolutely. I just knowing that the power that image can have, particularly symbolic images. So maybe you didn't think about that, judging from your reaction. But I'm just wondering if you could comment on your thoughts about the power of image to invoke something in us beyond maybe visceral, but maybe spiritual kind of feelings or heightened feelings of awareness.
Well, I guess I really believe that images can change us, particularly photography. I think. Well, you could say that about all art, but I am, as you know, someone who teaches photography. I'm really interested in the power of a photograph to act on us. So I don't know that I would ever presume that my work would be a sort of gateway to kind of some kind of spiritual experience, but I do believe that photographs or the art has the power to act on us and change how we think about things. Mm-hmm. And if anything, I guess one of the great things about showing this work is that it's an opportunity to open up dialogue, which is what your program does so beautifully.
Thank you.
And I think, anytime that we have an opportunity to talk about Jerusalem and the impact that the confluence of the faiths in that city, the sort of impact that has on all of us.
Right.
And it kind of goes beyond spirituality into political and geopolitical issues. So I think in many ways I see the project as a gateway to dialogue.
Oh, that's nice. That's a nice way to put it. I like that. So I want to ask you about, I don't know quite, I'm not an artist, so I don't know quite how to describe this. Your work, because of the technique, I suppose, is not black and white, it's not monochromatic, but it's not color.
Right.
Is that a product of the technique, or is that purpose? So that was part of your thinking and going that route?
You might notice, it's hard to see here because these are kind of close-ups, but in the exhibition, the images are printed onto, there's a separate layer of paper between the ink and the paper behind. So it's a process called chincolé. And so basically when so there's a sheet of paper, then on top of the plate, the copper plate, we put an extra piece of paper that's wet and sits absolutely exactly on top of the plate. And then as the paper goes through the press, it becomes glued to the background. So it has this extra layer. And there's something kind of interesting about that because when I was making these photographs in 2013, I happened to be in the city at the same time as President Obama and John Kerry. And so there was this big push in terms of the peacemaking process in that moment. But there was also a sandstorm at the same time. In fact, President Obama had to take a helicopter into Bethlehem rather than traveling by road. Oh no, he had to go by road instead of helicopter because of the sandstorm. So there was this kind of color to the air. And so this background in many ways kind of represents some kind of atmospheric experience of the time.
This is going to sound like an odd question,
Okay.
but when you're in the garden, can you touch the trees? Are they roped off, or are they?
They're set back. There's a fence all the way around. It's
Okay, so they're protected. So it's,
it's not a strange question at all. But because I actually got permission to go behind the fence and into the garden, but I did not touch them.
Right.
I did not.
Yeah, and they. We were talking earlier. They're kind of caretakers, right? The Franciscan monks.
Yes.
Who I guess reside at the Church of All Nations.
They oversee the garden and the Church of All Nations, and you can get permission to go in and photograph. And I was lucky enough to meet one of the gardeners whose father also worked in the garden, and so it's a very well cared for space.
I find this fascinating. Well, that's it for Religion and Life today. I hope you'll join us again next week when we continue to explore the relationship between culture, society, and religion. Until then, this is Ozzy Ostwald.